everyone, this is Dr. Corey Glenn, and I'm going to be sharing a case today that I really want to serve as a tutorial on how I'm doing 2-appointment dentures using the Glenn denture trays that I developed. And so this is the end result of this case. You can see we ended up getting a great result the second time that I saw this patient after doing his initial visit. And if you look at the grid, you can see the teeth ended up where they should be. They're proportioned to his face. He was happy with them. And so let's jump into this case and show how I'm using these. So first of all, these Glenn denture impression trays are available from Blue Sky Bio. I'll try to put a link in the video comments, but they're basically a small, medium, and large set of edentulous trays, but they're kind of unique in that, one, they're thermoplastic, so they can be custom molded to some degree within the mouth, which is going to enable you to get a first visit master impression. But then the other big thing that was always missing for me trying to do a similar technique was that I didn't really have a good aesthetic reference to know where to set teeth. And so what's unique here is that these do actually have teeth on them, and that's going to enable you to get a quote preview. It's not an exact try-in, but it's a preview of where things should be, and even if they're off, then it gives you a reference for where the teeth need to go, or for your lab technician. Okay, so this is just another view of the trays. The maxillary trays, they have a big slot in them, so if you needed to conform this to a really wide arch, you can snip the little piece at the back here, and that gives you tons of flexibility to widen the arch, or you can even overlap the palate a little bit and make it for a really narrow arch. The borders are going to be pretty close for most edentulous patients, and if they're not, if they're long, it's really easy to adjust. They're just a plastic tray. And then I want to throw this out there because I do think the armamentarium that you use going into this is going to have a lot of effect on how efficient you are with this process. So obviously the trays, again, from Blue Sky Bio, but you're going to need some form of getting some really, really hot water. And so if you've got a water bath, great. Those are a little slow for my liking, so I use one of these little electric kettles that I get off Amazon. They're dirt cheap, they boil water quickly, and usually I can do a case very quickly with these. And then probably one of the things that's most invaluable to me when I'm doing these cases are these moldable plastic beads. So if you've never used these, you really, really owe it to yourself to get some of them. Many dental supply places make these. You can also get them off Amazon. These are the particular ones I use, but really affordable, $7, and this will treat a ton of patients. And what I love about this is it's going to give you the consistency in the body of like a PVS putty, but for way, way cheaper, for a longer working time, and it's just very conducive to this technique. I couldn't hardly do removable without these after having used them so long. So this would replace your PVS putty if you use that. It would replace your compound, and so I'll show you more of how I'm using that as we go along. And then finally, the hedgehog burr from Parkel, or a similar style burr that has these little spikes on it. The reason for that is you're inevitably going to have to do some adjusting on either the tray or on your thermoplastic material after it's kind of set up. And if you've ever used a traditional e-cutter burr on thermoplastic or just plastic materials in general, you know it's going to melt it, it's going to gum up the flutes of your burr, and then you're just kind of stuck. So what I found with these is that because they have those little spikes, one, they adjust really aggressively, but they'll take material away with just a very light touch. And with these, I find if I use just a light touch, I can quickly modify any of these materials, and it won't generate near as much heat and friction, which is going to end up melting it. And so again, I can't highly enough recommend these hedgehog burrs. I've used them for years. They're great. All right, so here's our patient. This patient came to the charitable clinic that I work at every other week, and he had no existing dentures and had his teeth removed a while back, and now he's ready to proceed with dentures. So these are always the most challenging cases because you really got to start from ground zero. And if you're doing it like most of us were taught in dental school, you're looking at 5 appointments at best, and a lot of times a lot more than that. And so the first step is we've got to choose the correct size tray. So the way I usually do that, I'm going to take a set of calipers and measure the width of their nose, and then I'm going to go over to the trays and pick the size trays that most closely corresponds to that with the canine to canine width of the teeth on the tray. And that's generally going to be a really close reference for which tray you use. And so in his case, we ended up with the medium. I find that's the one that I use the vast majority of the time, unless it's a really large patient or a really small patient. But ultimately, you still want to take the tray, you want to try it in. And so what you notice here is that I'm trying this in, I'm kind of gauging the width back here at their tuberosities compared to where the hamular notches would be on these trays. And this one lined up well. I went ahead and inserted it fully, and as you can see here, it goes into place. Are the teeth perfectly scaled? No, it's not important that anything be perfect with this as far as tooth position. What's important is that you get it in the ballpark and then use that as a reference. And so when I seated this, everything fit well. I didn't feel like we needed to make any major adjustments. Going back to this picture, one thing I did notice once I fully seated it in his mouth was that these areas back in here, I could already tell that they were pushing up into the vestibule. So I just preemptively took those and adjusted them back a little bit. All right, again, it's a plastic tray, easy to modify, no problem in doing that. And there'll be further opportunities throughout the process where if you notice a long border or something like that, you can do it. Additionally, if I was looking here and I see, well, the hamular notches seem to be sitting over the ridge, but they've got a significant undercut in the anterior. We'll go ahead and heat this tray up, thermoplast it, and bend that anterior vestibular border backward. All right. Or if the borders need to be bent out, I would just do that preemptively. I generally am not trying to pull that off in the mouth. I just eyeball it and say, okay, well, that needs adjustment, and I just heat it up and I do it outside the mouth, try it back in. That seems to be the most efficient way for me to do this. All right, so you can thermoplast your tray, try to get it pretty close to an ideal fit in their mouth, and then we can go on to the what I'll call the initial impression. So this is where my thermoplastic beads come in. I've chosen the right tray, but now I need to get it somewhat more customized to the arch, because right now it's sitting in there loose. It's not an intimate fit anywhere. And so what I would do is I would just have a little bowl, pour some really hot water in there, and just dump in a handful of these thermoplastic beads. So they're going to be white and really stiff initially, and after about 15 to 20 seconds you're going to see them go fully transparent, and that's when you can just pull them out of the water and they're going to have this really nice dough-like consistency. And so at that point I'm just going to line the inside of this tray, and if I'm going to err, I err towards overfilling it a little bit. It's not critical that you fill in every void and capture every tissue surface, but what I do want to do is I usually want to capture at least some good solid seating areas. On the mandible, that would be on the buccal shelf and maybe the top of the ridge, but I also want to capture the borders so that I can see where those borders are forming out to, see if my tray is long. All right, so bottom right, you see that I'm forming this into the tray. And again, this stuff has a really long working time, so there's no huge hurry with this like there sometimes can be with compound, PVS, some of the other materials we've used. All right, so this is kind of where the technique deviates from maybe other thermoplastic trays that you've used. What I'm going to do is I've got a little bit overloaded with the thermoplastic beads. You could also use PVS putty if that's what you have, but again, I really think you'll like those beads if you use them. So I'm going to seat the tray in his mouth, and I'm also trying to get the teeth positions correct in his face. And so the way I'll approach that is I'll just put it in. The teeth are going to be hanging too long unless I push it up in there. And first thing, I'm going to just try to get the midline in the ballpark. All right. And then I'm going to look from straight on the patient's face, and I'm going to try to get the interpupillary line set with his occlusal plane. And so that's really easy if you just stick a Fox plane on like I've done here. Just eyeball that to the interpupillary line. And then I'm going to have someone else, usually an assistant, that's looking from a lateral view, and they're kind of looking for the alitragus alignment. And so with any of these, it's not going to be perfectly aligned initially, and that's where the thermoplastic beads are so helpful, because they give you some body where you can push against this tray. And so if I'm looking and it's hanging down too far on, let's say, his right side, I can just kind of squeeze up on that right side and get it parallel to interpupillary. And then the assistant says, hey, the anterior needs to come up so that it'll parallel alitragus. And I squeeze and push on it more in the anterior. and this material just deforms and deflects out of the way and kind of takes the shape of the pressures you're putting on it. And then as a last step, I would kind of be eyeballing his incisal edge position at rest. And so depending on the patient and age and all that kind of stuff, male, female, I might want anywhere from 2 to 0 millimeters of incisal show at rest. And so once I've aligned the planes and the midline, now I'm just going to sink the tray in deeper, trying not to change those planes, but just sink it in deeper until I have the incisal edge at rest where I want it. Okay? And again, these are just a plastic tray. Everything with this is thermoplastic. So if you've screwed something up, man, heat it up and try again. That's what's so forgiving about this. All right, so you can see we got pretty good alignment. If I have one complaint with these bead-like materials, it's that they tend to have too long of a working time. And so, by the time I've done all of this, which usually takes about 30 seconds, by that time I'm ready to take the tray out of the mouth, but that material is not fully set. Okay, that's not a concern. Just go ahead and try to take it out of the mouth without distorting it, and then you just want that material to cool off. If you sit there in the patient's mouth, it'll take all day to cool off to a degree where it turns white again. So I just keep a little bowl of cool water on the desk too. As soon as I take it out, I'll drop it in there and let this chill, and you see how now it's gone from that translucent appearance back to a white. And this is really, really hard and stiff. Okay, so unlike compound, which you might have on the border of a tray, it can flake off, it's pretty brittle. Man, this stuff is so strong and easy to modify, so I prefer to use this. So I cool it off, and now that it's cooled off and hard, I can take it out and handle it. Is it possible I might have distorted something a tiny bit during the removal process? Sure. It doesn't happen to me generally, but if I had, that's okay, because all we're making here is a custom tray. A custom tray where the teeth have been somewhat aligned to the face. All right, we're going to come back and do a legit PVS border molded impression inside of this as we go along. All right, so this is where your Parkel hedgehog burr or something similar is going to come in really handy. All right, so if I look at this area, and you can almost see it a little better in this image. If you can track my mouse right here, do you see how as I look around here at this peripheral roll, this tray is sitting well out beyond it. So I didn't catch that initially when I was trying the tray in. That's fine. At this point, the bead material itself is going to hold this shape. So if I see any prematurities, any long borders, anything like that, I'm just going to take this burr and just shave that back. So here we're shaving back that area. If you overdid it and had too much material in here, shave that back. Again, just keep a light touch because it is a plastic material, it's thermoplastic. So if you just lay into it real hard, you'll generate enough friction that it'll gum up your burr. All right, so I'll shave back any areas of the tray that are sticking out too far. And I'm treating this like I would a denture case if I just border molded a custom tray with compound. All right, so this is basically flowed into all the borders, and while it's in the mouth, I will do a little pulling on their cheeks and stuff to somewhat form those borders. So I don't expect them to be really long excessively anywhere unless the tray was what was long in that process, because it was already hard, it wasn't adapting itself. So at this point, I've adjusted back any of the prematurities, any of the long borders, and then I might take this and just lower the entire peripheral border by maybe a millimeter. All right, because if this is truly the border and now I come back and I add PVS and border mold that, I might overextend my borders. So I would like to capture my final borders with some heavier medium body PVS that I can really border mold. All right. So here the tray has been modified. I've thinned out areas. I've removed areas that the tray was sticking out like you see right here. But what I did notice is I'm not quite to my hamular notch here. All right, with maxillary dentures, it's absolutely critical that you capture that hamular notch and that you get back to the vibrating line. So again, why I like these beads is they're so forgiving. We can add to the existing material. It's easy to take away. So I'm going to heat up a little bit more beads, kind of form it into a rope. And while it's nice and soft, I'll form it to my posterior border where I know I'm short back here. this patient's arch was really long in an anterior posterior dimension. So here they are, they're clear. You see this, I've formed that border and I've added a little to that hamular notch, and now I'm going to reinsert it. It's going to sit back in the same position because of all of this anatomy we've got on this, but we're looking to form the borders back here in our hamular notches and around the posterior palate. Alright, so now when that's done, you see now I've got a full peripheral roll back here in the hamular notches. I've captured all of the palatal tissue back as far as I need to, and you can kind of see some little fuzzies along the border here in the left. That's where I've just lowered my borders by about 1 mm. And now I'm ready to apply some adhesive, and I'm going to do a true border molded master impression. And do make sure you use adhesive. If you don't use that, you're going to get those little fins where the material is thin in an area and it just kind of flakes off. Alright, so as far as how I do my impression technique, I mean, do whatever works for you. I really like the technique that Joe Masad teaches, which is the dual viscosity impression. And so remember, this is fully formed to their anatomy for the most part. I don't need loads and loads of material. So what I'll usually do is I'll use a light body on the internal here, and then on all of my borders and maybe a little bit in the palate where you've got a critical seating area, I'll put maybe some heavy body there. Primarily I want the heavy body on the borders because it will act, one, as a dam to prevent my lighter body stuff from just squishing out the back and going down the patient's throat. But secondly, it's going to hold up better to those border molding movements. All right, and that's really important. We want to capture all the anatomic borders as we're doing this. So we reinsert it. You can see the alignment has maintained the same. I try not to go overboard with the material because I don't want it flowing down their throat and causing gagging and all that stuff. But here you see the final impression. We've captured a really nice peripheral roll all the way around, including the hamular notches. If I don't see a great impression in those hamular notches, we're redoing it. All right, that's absolutely critical on maxillary dentures. But again, we've got a really nice border molded impression, and so we're done with the maxilla here. All right, so now we can move on to the mandible. I'm not going to go through this in as much detail. I'm just going to repeat all the steps. I'll try it in. I'll look for any borders that I just know are long right off the bat, pre-adjust those. If I see that the borders need to be bent out or in, I'll do that with the hot water and thermoplast those trays. But once I've got it in the ballpark, I'll take more of my thermoplastic beads, line the inside of it, all right? And I'll squish that in place. Now, it varies. Sometimes I will try to see if I can leave the upper in and maybe guide them into a bite with this. In this case, I didn't bother with it, and I'm going to show you how you can do it either way. Sometimes you can end up with an excess of material back here where it's difficult for the patient to bite because there's interference back there. These are not a fully true customized tray where you've made it, 1 or 2 mm thick back in that area. So you can run into interferences. So if I anticipate that's the case, I just won't worry about it. I'll just focus on getting a great mandibular master impression. Alright, so we've got the borders all formed. Same thing, light body interior, heavy body on the borders, and then we're going to reinsert this and we're going to do all of our border molding movements as this material sets. And here is the great mandibular master impression. Alright, you can see I've got a nice contoured border all the way around. We have gotten all our critical anatomy, which on the mandible, that's really important that you get your retromolar pad, your buccal shelf, and then a nice rolled border everywhere. Okay, so I'm happy with this mandibular impression. Now this is what I was mentioning earlier. I would love it if I could insert this and be able to just get the patient's centric occlusion and VDO just with these trays. All right, and oftentimes you can do that. And so I don't anymore try to do this right from the start where I'm absolutely set on getting those in. What I'll do is at this point I'll take them and just try them both in. If they just simply cannot bite down and get to the proper VDO, my first question is, okay, where is the interference? Well, if it's on teeth, that's fine. Just whack the teeth. You can adjust these down with that same Parkel burr and get them equilibrated into a nice centric and VDO. However, what's more commonly the case when they can't get all the way together is that it's back here at the heels of the casts. All right, so the retromolar pad area and interfering with the tray up in the hamular notch area. So if that's the case, I'm not going to sit there and try to modify that and thin it all out. It would just take me too long to do that. So what I would do instead, and this is where it might vary a little bit. If you're doing an analog workflow, you're going to send this to the lab for a physical denture setup versus a digital workflow. All right. So first of all, if I'm doing this with a analog workflow, then at that point what I'll probably do is just set aside this mandibular impression and do one of two things. Either take another tray, and you can just shorten that tray down. You're not worried about capturing a full master impression at this point. Just treat it as an occlusal rim. All right, so if there's interferences in the back, just cut the back part of the tray off. You can reline it with your thermoplastic beads. Get your VDO correct. All right, if you need to open them more, use some wax. If you need to close them more, grind on the tray or put more thermoplastic beads on the inside, and just make chairside bite rims. All right. Other option, you could do a mush bite. All right, these beads make a great material for a mush bite. Just get a big chunk of it, form it into a hot dog, lay it on the mandibular arch, and now with the maxillary tray in, close them into the proper VDO and centric. All right, you can use a beeswax mush bite. You could use a PVS putty mush bite. All right, so those are all options if you're doing it analog. However, I'm not doing it analog. I'm doing a digital workflow. And so ultimately, I'm going to scan all these anyways. I'm not even going to send physical models. And so you can either use an intraoral scanner or a desktop scanner. But what I'm going to do is go ahead and scan this mandibular tray. And I'm focused mainly on the intaglio of my impression, right? That's what's generating my master model. And so I usually orient it on my scanner like this. If you're doing it with an intraoral scanner, then you could simply scan all of the interior of that, capture all your borders, but I do try to roll over and also capture the buccal of the teeth, because that's ultimately going to be needed to capture your buccal bite and relate these scans together. All right, so if you find that your scanner, whatever type you choose to use, I'm using a desktop, but if you find it struggling to scan the material, just use some CAD powder. All right, you can use scanning powder. Every single dental supply company has this, and it's just going to knock the gloss off that and make this really easy to scan. All right, so now we fully scanned the lower, and here is that impression scanned. Again, you see I've picked up the buccal of the teeth, but I've captured all of the internal. That's what I'm concerned with. All right, this is how it looks during the scanning process. And let me mention, with all of your scanners, they're going to kind of lead you through a workflow, right? So normally it's going to prompt you, scan your upper, and then when you're done with that, scan your lower, and then when you're done with that, scan your buccal bite. There is no rule that you just have to go in that order though. All right, so in this desktop scanner workflow, it wants the buccal bite first, and then the upper, and then the lower. But I can just simply tab over and keep this case open. I'm just scanning the lower first. And then I'm going to modify this so that you can see how I'm using this. All right, so remember it was interfering in the back there. Well, now that data is saved, I don't need to have a fully intact impression anymore. So I just take a little wheel blade and just cut off, basically from about first molar's back. All of that area that was interfering, I'm just getting rid of it, because this is still going to sit in their mouth really precisely. But now I don't have to worry about its interference with the upper. All right, you could have just as easily done this with the upper tray if you wanted. If you want to scan it first and then cut off the posterior area of that, that's fine as well. All right, but one or the other, you're just going to cut that area off if it's interfering. And now we can start working on using this like a bite rim. So the teeth on the mandibular tray are of not that much consequence. I don't need those for aesthetics. The maxilla is what drives the aesthetics. And so initially I put it in, and just the way I'd set the tray, he was still a little high. And so I just ground off the teeth, grind into the occlusal of the tray. That's perfectly fine. And then what I found is I overdid it. And so now I'm just going to take some wax and I'm going to put some wax back on there. And with that wax heated, I can close the patient in, and we're going to work on their centric bite, getting them in centric, and then we want the VDO to be correct. All right, how do you check VDO? My go-to is I use one of these little simple VDO gauges. You could also use a caliper, but I'm measuring from the canthus of the eye down to the corner of the lip. All right, because even smiling versus over closed a little bit, that corner of the lips doesn't change that much in its position. All right, so it's relatively consistent. And for most patients, their ideal VDO is going to be where that distance right here, corner of the eye to corner of the lips, should correspond to base of the nose to the bony portion of the chin. And so you can see I'm not going soft tissue of the chin. I'm pushing that in and trying to bottom out on bone, and I'm not quite to the base of the nose yet. So I'll sink them in a little bit deeper. If you need to heat your wax up and just make it soft enough where they can bite and squeeze in that last little bit, that would work. Take a knife to it, whatever you want to do. All right. So now we've got his VDO correct. Now here's what I want you to notice. The goal for me was to get the teeth in the ballpark. Am I concerned about the fact that his midline is sitting off here to the right? No. Am I concerned that really, now that I look at it with him smiling, we need the incisors longer? No, I'm not concerned about that. This is just going to serve as a ballpark reference, and then we use this to go and make those changes in the real denture. All right, but you won't know any of that unless you take this picture. The picture is absolutely critical with this technique. All right, so take a picture. iPhone, cell phone pic is fine. So now you see my final records. Remember, we've already scanned the master lower impression. We've got our master upper impression here, and we've got him in-centric and at the correct VDO. So the way I'm approaching it here, I'm going to just go ahead and scan the rest of this. Again, if you're doing an analog workflow, send it all to the lab and let them pour and mount this up. Just tell them, don't separate the models until you've mounted this in the bite, because if you pull a stone model out of this impression, it's never going to go back in the way it needs to, because this is also your bite rim. All right, but that's analog. I'm doing it digital. Remember, it prompts you, it wants buccal bite, upper, lower. Well, I just tabbed over, I scanned my lower first, and now I've left it open. I'm just going to go back and now scan my buccal bite. All right, so these are oriented in the bite, and I'll just put that on the plate. I'll scan that. Here's my buccal bite. And now it's going to want the upper. All right, so now I just take the upper tray, orient that on the scan table, and I'm going to scan that, but you want the intaglio facing up. We do want to capture the appearance of the teeth on the buccal, especially for the maxilla, but mainly we're after the internal of this impression and all the details, because that's our master model. All right, and so this has all been scanned now, and we're ready to go ahead and either start the design process if you're doing it yourself, or just send it all to the lab. All right. Again, I want to stress, you've got to take a reference picture with everything in the mouth, because this is what's going to tell you or the lab, whoever's doing the design or setting teeth, this is what tells them where those teeth need to go. All right. So what can I learn from this simple picture here? Just a cell phone picture taken from straight ahead. What I know is that his midline is off by about 1.5 millimeters. So when we go to set teeth, we need to move that over. I can tell from just the picture and from the fact that I did that Fox plane that the occlusal plane is generally good. But everything does need to come down towards his lower lip by, I'd say, 1 to 2 millimeters. When I'm looking at a patient's smile, if they're the patient that doesn't show much teeth, then I'm probably going to have the maxillary teeth pretty much being all that shows. All right, I'm going to be aiming for the wet dry line of the lip with their maxillary incisors. When you have a patient that has a really broad smile, hypermobile lips, all of that kind of stuff, the way I tend to think of it as a starting point is I think of everything in between the lips here as a frame, and I usually want to have my maxillary teeth taking up 2/3 of that frame. And so here it's about dead even. So I'm thinking I want to bring that incisal edge of the new teeth down 1 to 2 millimeters. All right. If you're not setting the teeth, don't worry about this. Your denture technician should know these kind of things, but they're not going to know it unless you provide this picture. All right. They might just take your tray and match exactly to where you had the maxillary teeth. So make sure you take the picture. All right. What else can we determine? Well, what about overall tooth scaling? All right, so we generally use the width of the nose, but noses come in all shapes and sizes. You can have patients with a really wide nose or an excessively narrow nose. I find the inner canthus of the eye to be a more consistent reference, and so that's what these lines are dropping down. I think if we went the full width of his nose, that's nearly as wide as his mouth, and he would end up with way big teeth. So this is coming down from the canthus of the eyes, which are hidden under these glasses. How is my tooth scaling? Well, from canine to canine, that looks pretty darn good. Looks like we did a good job scaling that. All right. What about the occlusal plane relative to his allotragus? Well, I used the Fox plane. I know that's pretty well aligned, but again, everything in the maxilla needs to come downward, showing too much lower, not enough upper. All right. What about the buccal position of the wet dry line of his lip reference to his maxillary incisors? Well, I think it's aiming in the right direction. It's just not far down enough. All right. So all of this is valuable information to know. All right, so I did the design. I like doing the design, and I just feel like I can't miss it when I have all this information. But again, as long as you send that picture and you've taken good impressions and a good centric and VDO, your lab should be able to knock this out of the park. All right. So what's nice is I've got, from all of that data I scanned, an upper master model, I've got a lower master model, and then I've got this great buccal bite, right? And that shows where the teeth were on the tray. And if I reference back and forth to that picture I took, then there's no doubt where I need to put the ideal teeth. All right, so we start the process of setting teeth. I'm not going to focus on that in here. In this case, I used ExoCAD. You can also use Blue Sky Plan. I kind of go back and forth between the two. You can use 3Shape. Whatever tooth setting program you want to use is irrelevant. All right, but what is relevant is that you correlate that picture and that you know where to set your ideal teeth. So I haven't changed the scaling, the width of the teeth very much. What I have done is I've placed the incisal edges down about 1.5 millimeters from where they were on the tray in green. I've also moved that midline over that 1.5 millimeters that I could tell it was off from my picture. All right, so there's just no question. Other than that, I'm not changing the overall plane of occlusion. I like my VDO. All of that stuff is pretty obvious to me, so I'm not going to go screwing with that. So just to show you some lateral views of this, again, everything is shifted back a little bit to this is his right side because of the midline being off. But I didn't bring the teeth more facial outward, right? Because remember, we were already aiming toward the wet dry line of his lip, and so I don't want to bring it out more buccal or more lingual. I want to kind of keep that same trajectory. All right. If you are the one doing the design, or hopefully your lab knows this, but I always design the maxilla first because aesthetics always drives the case. All right, that's what determines how they're going to look. However, you can't then just go stick the lower teeth to them in this perfect class 1 occlusion, because I find that if my mandibular teeth are not sitting over the top of the ridge like you see here, that lower denture is going to be even more of a problem than it normally would be. And so oftentimes what I find is, okay, the uppers are set to the ideal aesthetics, but just the way that the jaw is resorbed, I might have to move some posterior teeth in crossbite to get them centered over the ridge. I might have to leave a little bit of an anterior open bite. It just depends where the ridge is on the mandible. But if you don't have your mandibular teeth centered on the ridge, you're going to have problems. All right. So here's all of the tooth positions. I've made this little tooth setting grid. That's irrelevant to this video. That's for another video. But I do want you to notice this. All right, if you are ever looking at a setup that the lab's done, or you're doing your own setup, you need to look at this ridge particularly here in the anterior, and just ask yourself the question, could these teeth feasibly be coming out of that ridge where I've got them? Because again, so often, if I just match the mandibular teeth to the maxillary, I might look and the pontic portion of that tooth is sitting way out here in the vestibule. Well, God didn't put that tooth there, right? There's no way in nature that that tooth could have emerged in that position. So I might need to change my inclination. If I can't do it and make a natural emergence out of that mandibular ridge that way, then I might have to bring the tooth back completely, get it over the ridge, and leave an anterior open bite. These are all just things that you've got to figure out during the tooth setting process. All right, there's my final tooth setup. And so in whatever software you're using at this point, you would now do your gingival design. So this is the initial gingival proposal. I would take this now, do some digital festooning, stretch it out, cover the necks of the teeth, all of those things. Or if this is the lab doing this analog, they would do this with wax. Whichever one is perfectly fine. And this is my final gingival design before having the final processing done. All right. And one cool thing, if depending on the program you're using, in this case I'm using exocad because I really like using their Smile Designer software. I can pull in that picture that I took of the patient's face during the initial appointment, and it allows me to align that. So if you see this 2D picture, there's a way that you align this to your 3D models, right? And you get them all superimposed where they're sitting in the same orientation. And that's great because that's going to now let us preview the design in his face. All right. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. All right. So I wouldn't consider this a photorealistic simulation, but what I can tell is that I seem to have nailed the midline. I like more how he's showing more of his maxillary teeth now. We're following the lower contour of the lip. I think this is in the ballpark of what I'm aiming for. Now this is never going to be as good as a true try-in, but hey, it's a lot better than nothing. So send this picture, make sure your lab has this, and if you're getting back designs that are not up to par, ask them to use this. Tell them you want to see a digital design preview in like a Smile Designer type software. All right, because once you do that, it starts becoming really evident of, yeah, this design is not cutting it. All right, and hopefully you cut off some of those problems. It's got all kinds of little golden proportion rulers and things like that. But again, if you're not the one designing, you just need to ask your lab to do this if they're not giving you consistent results. All right, so now I'm going to fabricate. If you're sending this to the lab, they're going to fabricate. They could mill this design, they could print this design, or they could do, pack and press acrylic and denture teeth. I'm printing this, and so we used the Rodin denture base. I'm using the Shining 3D Cell printer, which is my main workhorse. And you can see I was printing a lot of denture bases this day, but his upper and lower maxillary and mandibular bases are on here. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to print the teeth as well. So I use Sculpture 2.0 resin in an A1 or a B1 shade. And then we're going to bond that together. All right, so the way I do that, I just suck up some more of the pink resin uncured, make sure everything's fitting together properly, and then I'm going to fill my sockets with more of the uncured pink resin, index my teeth fully in there, wipe away the excess, and then cure all that together. All right, so you end up essentially with a monolithic denture, even though it's been with two different materials. They're mainly different in the pigments that are used. And so this is the final design prior to polishing. And the very next time I saw this patient, we delivered this set of dentures. All right. Now he's smiling a little awkward. This is all new to him. He's not a big smiler anyway. But if I critique this, I can tell that I hit the landmarks that I was aiming for. So again, this green line is parallel to interpupillary, and this one is the same line. So how's our occlusal plane? Well, it looks like we're right on it. All right. What about the midline? So this is going right through the midline of his face, and we nailed it dead on. Despite the fact that our tray wasn't dead on, but we knew that based on that picture, we knew exactly where to move it to, so it would be correct. What about the inner canine width? All right, we seem to have got that as well. What about the overall scaling of the teeth? We seem to have gotten that. All right, and again, if I do this on his full face, you can see that we hit all of our aesthetic targets that we were after. Our occlusal plane seems to be correct. We did very, very minimal adjustment on his bite because we got a good centric record. And so I was really happy with how this came out, and I sure can't complain with the fact that we did this entire denture in 2 appointments. First visit captured every single thing that we needed to go to completion using those Glen Denture trays, and then we were able to deliver a really nice result on the second visit. All right, now I always do get the question, which I'll throw out real quick, well, what if it's not ideal? All right, this is what I love about printed dentures. I'm not doing a try-in because, crap, what's the worst that can happen? If I made my final denture and it's off, I'm out $8 to $10 of resin. I'll just make modifications on that, take a new picture, go back and redesign and make those corrections. I'm really not out that much, and now we're at a 3-appointment denture. But I find that that's just not the case very often, and more often than not, this second visit denture is exactly what I want, and we're done with the process. All right, so I don't see the point, if you're doing printed dentures in particular, with doing try-ins unless you're having trouble with lab communication, whatever the case may be. Now, if you're doing milled or conventional dentures, I totally get it, because that's a lot more effort and expense if you have to come back and redo it. So that's kind of a judgment call for you and how your process is going to be. But the way I do it with digital and with printed dentures, I just don't see the point of try-ins. So anyway, that's the completed case. I hope you found that helpful. If you're interested in trying this out, I'm not going to say there's no learning curve. There's a learning curve to everything you do. You're going to have to do it and get your fingers wet and just try this out a time or two. But this is not rocket science. Anyone can learn this technique, and hopefully you can end up getting better results much quicker and actually get some of the profitability back in your denture workflow. If you want to purchase these trays, they're available at Blue Sky Bio's website under Glen Denture Trays. And if you've got questions or anything like that, see my YouTube videos for other technique videos, or you can reach out to me through my website at coryglenn.org. And anyway, hope you found that helpful. Thanks.